Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the afternoon session of the LSI Wood Protection Operators Seminar. As this morning, we will have 3 poll questions this afternoon that will need to be answered for those states that need poll questions for a accreditation. Also, at the end of the day, there are some states that require a test, and those folks will need to stay on and take the test. Our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Rebecca Curry. Rebecca's topic is hazards of working with pesticide products. Rebecca is currently a senior toxicologist in the Regulatory Affairs Group at LSI. She was formerly a toxicologist in the Product Stewardship and Regulatory Affairs Group at Eastman Chemical Company, and she was assistant professor in the biology department at Roanoke College and a research associate at Virginia Tech. Rebecca earned her PhD from Virginia Tech, investigating ecosystem stressors from active and abandoned coal mine sites and industrial effluent. Rebecca is also certified as a senior ecologist by the Ecological Society of America. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, Grady. Every time I hear that dissertation title, it makes me think of the fact that I can no longer jump into the back of a pickup truck wearing a pair of hip boots anymore. So it makes me feel really old. But like Grady said, we're going to spend the next 45 to 50 minutes talking about the hazards of working with pesticides. The objective of this presentation is to give you just an overview of pesticide toxicity and to describe how pesticides are evaluated for risk. And this is important because you should have an understanding of how risks are evaluated for the products and active ingredients that you're working with, and to understand where the data come from that are available to you on the safety data sheets and on the labels. So I think in order to be safe while handling these materials, you really should have some background on where this information is coming from and what does the EPA do with this information in order to try to make sure that everybody is working safely and has the information available to do that. Let's see if I can get this to, oh. There we go. Now we're moving. So I've got just a couple of cartoons here just to kind of get the presentation going. Obviously, there's a little cartoon of the label here on the left, which I'm sure that all of you are very familiar with. You want to make sure that you're always reading these labels and following the recommendations and using the appropriate PPE. I threw in the read the label first campaign from the EPA here because it's really important. And again, I'll emphasize it several times throughout my presentation. And I threw in the exploding chest pictogram here because it's important that when you look at the safety data sheets that you can recognize these pictograms, you know what they mean, because they really are your quick reference to whatever hazards might be potentially, or you might have a potential to be exposed to or working with these materials. And in this case, exploding chest is, obviously not quite as scary as the skull and crossbones, but it does indicate that something has the potential to be a carcinogen. It can be a sensitizer, can cause a variety of different types of toxicity. So again, you want to make sure that you understand what each of these symbolize with regards to hazard. So for the talk today, I'm going to present just an overview of pesticides. A lot of this information you're probably familiar with. We'll talk about toxicity and exposure and risk. We'll talk a little bit about pesticide product registration. Again, many of you probably are engaged in this actively and have some experience here. We'll talk a little bit about acute versus chronic toxicity and what type of data we generate from these different types of tests. We'll talk about ecotoxicity, environmental fate, and human health testing. We'll briefly cover what a dose-response relationship is because it's useful in understanding how this information or these data are used for risk, to identify risk. We'll talk about exposure. This is where we'll get into the presentation. We talk a little bit more about the risks to people that are exposed while working with these materials. So we'll talk about the different types of exposure. Briefly, we'll talk about human risk assessment, some of the hazards and symptoms of exposure, and we'll end with just a few comments about the hazards of specifically wood preservatives. So just to start off with a definition, EPA considers any substance, or it could be a mixture of substances, that's intended to prevent, destroy, repel, or mitigate any pests. So that's fairly straightforward. It can also be a substance or a mixture that's intended for use, say, as a plant growth or plant regulator, a defoliant, or a desiccant. So those are also considered to be pesticides. They have to be registered like a pesticide. An example of a plant regulator would be a plant growth inhibitor. These are used frequently to treat crops like oat, wheat, barley. They're used in horticulture, at nurseries. They cause plants to be shorter in stature and stockier. So if you were planting wheat and you wanted to make sure that it was nice and healthy and not so tall and easily blown over by the wind, in a lot of cases they'll be treated with these plant growth inhibitors. And also if you go down to the nursery and you're looking at a shorter variety of a common plant like a boxwood, you'll see that they come in different sizes because of these different types of substances that we can add to them. Nitrogen stabilizers are also considered to be pesticides. They have to work against the soil bacteria to prevent them from actually going through the process of nitrification or ammonia volatilization in order to be a pesticide. So these are just very general definitions. Obviously, if you start looking at the EPA language, it can be very complicated to understand all the little nuances that EPA puts in and around some of these pesticides. But for our purposes, this is the ones that we're considering. So pesticides are they're substances that are meant to control pests. So anything that we find that's harmful to us, it's annoying, it causes disease, it interferes with our production of food, or just our general living conditions, is considered a pest. You know that you're dealing with a pesticide if you see the ICIDE ending. Examples, I'm not going to go through all of these, but herbicides, insecticides. The ICID ending refers to kill. So you see it in homicide and suicide. So anytime you see that, you know that you're working with something that's meant to repel, inhibit, or kill something. There are different types of pesticides. Most of the ones that we deal with in our daily lives are considered broad spectrum. They kill a variety of organisms. These would include the organophosphates, carbamate, pyrethroids, the neonicotinoid insecticides. They're very effective, but the problem is they can indiscriminately harm beneficial organisms. And we do see a lot of problems with these broad spectrum pesticides. For example, last year, September of 2020, up in North Dakota, the Cass County Vector Control Division decided that they wanted to spray for mosquitoes. They were having a fairly difficult mosquito season and wanted to do the aerial spraying to cut back. Obviously, mosquitoes can cause their own types of problems with West Nile virus and all kinds of other diseases. And a lot of municipalities will control them by aerial spraying. Unfortunately, their timing was not good, and they sprayed during the monarch butterfly migration through the area, and they killed just hundreds and hundreds of monarch butterflies. So it was quite, made the news. It was quite problematic. Similar incidences happen all the time. In 2016 in North Carolina, it was the same situation, spraying for mosquitoes using a pyrethroid, and they ended up killing, I think, about 2 million honeybees. And so it's problematic, and you have to be careful when you use them and what application you use them in. The narrow spectrum or selective pesticides target specific organisms. An example would be rodenticides, miticides, fungicides. Most of us will treat our yards at various times, especially if you're in the South. If you've got leaf spot, which is a fungus that grows on trees and things like that, you can easily treat your yard and your tree, and these products are meant to control specific things. Rodenticides, most of us are familiar with rat or mouse poison. It's designed to target them because it's made to attract them, so they'll ingest it, and then a lot of these are anticoagulants, and they'll cause internal bleeding, and that these animals will bleed to death. But it's targeted specifically for them. Not to say that they can't impact other organisms from time to time, but they're definitely designed not to be so broad in their treatment of things. They can be organic. We've got a bacillus bacteria that actually is a biological pesticide. So when it's consumed by insects, it actually has a toxin. It produces a toxic protein, and when it's ingested by insects, it kills them. It doesn't really harm humans and a lot of other species, but it can work very well against certain types of insects. Kaolin Clay was approved by the EPA in 1998. It acts as a barrier, so it has a barrier film that will stick when insects get on the leaf surface. It will stick to the insects. It becomes irritating, and it doesn't kill them, but it prevents them from wanting to stay there and consume whatever plant that or crop they may have be ingesting or trying to consume. Neem oil is very similar. It's the vegetable oil from the neem tree. You can get it at almost all of the nurseries and feed stores and places like Tractor Supply. They can be synthetic. Organophosphates such as glyphosate, which is Roundup, is an example, and the organochlorines such as DDT as well. So these are synthetic, but they all work based upon a specific mode of action, and that's what's the specific characteristic of the pesticide that when you choose it. So pesticides, they're again designed to affect specific target sites within an organism. So this mode of action, this can be a protein or an enzyme that's inhibited or blocked. So for example, organophosphates bind to an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase that controls nerve signals. If you block it, acetylcholinesterase interrupts the transmission of a nerve signal. So if you interrupt that with an organophosphate that binds to the enzyme that's needed, that nerve signal continues to fire, and it eventually causes mortality, and it's designed against insects. Larvicides affect insects by acting as a growth regulator. So they mimic the juvenile growth hormones. So you're keeping the insect in a juvenile state. It's not going to reproduce. So you're cutting down on the potential for that population of insects to grow and continue to be harmful. When we talk about pesticides, generally what we're interested in is the active ingredient. It's going to be listed on the label. It has to be listed on the label in the formulation or the product. It's the biologically or chemical active thing. It's what's working against your target pest or your pests. It has to be identified by name, and its percentage has to be included. It's what's doing the work. We also can have, or what we are also concerned with when we talk about pesticides, are metabolites. So these breakdown products can form when pesticides are exposed to the environment. So when they come in contact with air, water, soil, or even living organisms. And we're concerned with them because the pesticide, once it goes through this either hydrolysis or metabolism or whatever, these metabolites can be more hazardous than the parent material. And for example, I included the biocide BBNPA, which is it's a fantastic biocide. It works really well. We use it in a lot of down the hole applications for drilling. They use it in cooling tower applications to control algae and that bioslime that can build up. But it degrades, and the byproducts are more toxic, and this becomes a problem when you have to register these products because the EPA is concerned with that, because you know the toxicity of DBNPA. They're also going to want to know what the toxicity of these metabolites are. We're also having inert ingredients. You've probably seen these on the labels below the active ingredient. They'll usually make up the rest of the percentage of the formulation. They're added. They can be emulsifiers, solvents, carriers, propellants, dyes, and fragrances as well. And sometimes they're not listed. You'll just see it listed as other or as being proprietary. And then, of course, we have the end-use product, the final formulated product. And the label is going to state that it can't be used to manufacture or formulate anything else. So that's your final product. So all pesticides that are distributed or sold in the U.S., they have to be registered under FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act that was passed in 1996. It really hasn't changed all that much since then. It states that a registrant must show that you're using a pesticide according to the specifications on the label. It's not going to cause unreasonable adverse effects on the environment. And then you have to ask yourself, what is an unreasonable adverse effect? Because it might not mean the same thing for all of us. So they have to define that for us. And it means any unreasonable risk to, when we throw man in, man or the environment, so both humans and the environment, but they also consider the economic, social, and environmental costs and benefits of the use of any of these pesticides. So it's not just a simple definition. And it also is considered, you can have an unreasonable risk to mean a human dietary risk from residues that can result from the use of a pesticide in or on food, and that's inconsistent with the standard under Section 408 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So it's not quite that simple, but realistically, they can't cause any unreasonable harms. And again, we can define that different ways, but EPA takes it a little bit farther, and we're going to talk about that as we start talking about risk. So risk is a probability of harm or an adverse effect if exposed to a hazard. Right, so the rest of the presentation, you can just think of risk as when we're talking about pesticides and toxicity, it's hazard versus exposure. So a hazard is going to be its potential to cause harm, which we determine as toxicity based on a number of different types of guideline studies. So toxicity and hazard. So if something is really toxic, and say it's a benchtop chemical, it's not going to ever be sold. So there's no exposure. So the risk is minimal, right? That's fairly straightforward. If something is moderately toxic, but it has a high potential for exposure, then we're a lot more concerned with it. So risk, hazard times exposure. So the EPA has their risk paradigm. And if you look over on the right side of the screen, in order to determine risk, they're going to conduct a risk assessment. And based upon the risk is hazard times exposure, you can see we have the hazard identification, which is determining the toxicity or the potential effect of a pesticide. We're also interested in the exposure assessment, and we'll talk about exposure here in just a little bit. From that hazard identification, they develop what's called a dose response assessment. So they're going to take toxicity test data from a variety of different species, and they're going to try to make that relatable to human health. And we end up getting this dose response assessment. It's a numerical calculation that gets them there. And from that, we get a risk characterization. So we've identified our risk, and then there's the risk management part. So you do the risk assessment, you have a risk management. You can look at control options or legal considerations are included, and EPA always includes economic and social factors when they look at risk. And from that, you identify your risk management decision. So EPA is going to consider what the risk characterization is or how risky the use of a product is. They're going to go through this risk management process, and the risk management decision is going to take into account not just how harmful that this product might be, but what type of benefit does it have for society as well. And they have to balance that, because you can't just get rid of every single thing that has some type of a risk. I mean, there are chemicals and things that we really need in society, and we have to learn to work with them and have these risk management decisions and determine how to mitigate them. So EPA risk assessments fall into two categories. We've got environment and human health. Basic information, which is where we'll kind of go with the rest of this talk, is they have to know how much of a chemical is present in the environment, how much contact occurs between a person or wildlife or in the environment and the pesticide. What is the toxicity of the active ingredient? And all this information comes from the registrant, either during a new product registration or during re-registration of an existing product on a set schedule by the EPA. So realistically, the companies that are selling these products, these pesticides, we're responsible for making sure that we're providing all of the information to the EPA so they can make an accurate decision, a very definitive decision about risk. So for pesticide product registration, when you're registering a new product or you're going through the re-registration process, you're going to provide EPA with all these data. So from PhysChem data to toxicity data, all kinds of stuff. You're going to make sure they have access to it. And they're going to look at all that existing toxicity FATE/FSCM data. They're going to look at the manufacturing process. They're going to look at how often you rinse vessels and how often you clean rail cars. I mean, where does the waste go? They're going to look at all of this, and they're going to determine if they have enough information to determine the risk. And if not, they're going to give you a data call-in, which is going to just be a list of studies that they feel that you need to provide the data for. You know, they'll consider application rates and frequency and timing of your application. Again, what organisms or crops, what crops you're treating, what organisms you're preventing, and again, storage and disposal. And then you'll end up having to go back out. If you haven't provided them with enough information based on the data call-in, you'll have to go out and do more testing. All this testing has to be conducted following appropriate guidelines. And obviously we're in the US, so we'd be following US EPA guidelines, but ECHA over in Europe, they have their own set of guidelines, and they're very similar to the US. And a lot of times for registering in different global regions, we'll try to test so we cover both of requirements or recommendations for both guidelines. They have to follow good laboratory practices. You end up with a final report that has to go to the agency. They'll review it. A lot of times if you registered something decades ago, they have studies from back then. A lot of times they'll look at them. They may come back and say they're insufficient because, you know, obviously we've advanced a lot with regards to testing, and sometimes you have to retest. But from innovation of a new molecule to market, it can take up to 10 years, and it can cost millions of dollars to provide the data that EPA now requires in order to go through these registrations. When they're looking at the data that you have based upon what you're going to be using it for, they'll a lot of times be considering the characteristics and the potential exposure of the pesticides. And they'll ask for testing on both the active ingredient and the formulated product as well. You have to think about if you're using a pesticide in Iowa and it's only ever going to be used in Iowa, which is not realistic, but it was only ever going to be used in Iowa, then you're likely going to be doing your toxicity testing for the environment on freshwater species, because that's what you're going to be concerned with. You're not going to be concerned with marine organisms. But if you're using it in different states and you have the potential for runoff into a marine system, either the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific, or maybe it's the Gulf, then you have to do it on a variety of different species. And so they take all of that into consideration. If it's going to be aerial spraying, if it's going to be granular, it's amazing how many different types of studies we have now to have to consider. So if we start talking about the actual testing, one of the things that we'll consider is whether we're doing acute versus chronic toxicity testing. And this information results in the data, regenerate the data through these types of studies that actually go on the SDS. So if you see something, and it says, you'll see the human health, and a lot of times it'll give you the duration of the study and the endpoint, and it may include rabbits. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. In the eco part in section 12, it may say Daphnia magna. Well, this is where this information comes from. So if it's acute data, it's short-term. It's a short-term exposure. The endpoints are usually reported based on the lethality or the mortality that resulted in the study. It can be immobility, because if you think about the environment, not everything is going to be focused on mortality. Immobility is a huge problem. It's considered ecological death. If you're not moving around anymore, you're pretty much have had it. So, or some type of an impairment. The duration can be 24, 48, 72, or 96 hours, depending upon the species. Inhalation studies are the exception. They can have a 4-hour exposure, because these are different. You actually have these organisms in chambers, and you're utilizing masks and things, and we can do 4-hour exposures for those. They're a single dose most cases, but if there's a potential for long-term exposure or there's already suspected toxicity, we can run a lot of studies with multiple doses. This would be considered a repeat dose study. If it's aquatic testing, a lot of times we'll do a changeover. We'll actually make up concentrations in new vessels, and then we just move the organisms over with a net or a pipette, depending on what we're doing. Or sometimes we can run it in a flow-through system. So they have these giant diluter systems that recycle and introduce new solutions on a regular basis. So we can do it a variety of different ways, but we're trying to mimic some type of environmental realism if it needs to be a repeated dose based upon potential exposure. Endpoints are generally time-based. They look at the concentration that shows an adverse effect on 50% of the test organisms. So if you look on the SDS, you may see an LC50 value. So this would be the lethal concentration that killed 50% of your test organisms. EC50 would be an effect such as immobility, and then an LD50 is what we usually see when you're dosing, and this would be for mammalian toxicity testing. But again, they have an effect of 50%. It's an interpolation. You can do the XY graph and look to see where what concentration you see 50%. That's how they used to do it. You draw the graph and you draw the line down. You say, oh, 50% occurred at 5 milligrams per liter. Now we just use a computer program, but it's interpolation. You're estimating where you would see 50% of your population succumb. Chronic testing is longer term. It can be a variety of or a different type of duration depending upon the organism and the test that you're conducting. It can be from days to months to even a fishful life cycle. You may go a year. The endpoints are based upon a statistical comparison back to control organisms. So we're not doing interpolation. We actually have to have a control group. Still have to have a control group in your acute studies just to make sure it's valid and organisms are performing like they should. But in chronic tests, you're actually going to compare back to your control organisms using a statistical program. And we get a no observed effects level, or sometimes you'll see a no observed effect concentration, which would be no statistical difference from your control. So this would be the concentration where you have no effect whatsoever. And then one concentration up from that, if the first time that you see a statistical difference, that becomes your LOAC, or your lowest observed adverse effect. So we take acute and chronic testing and we look at the ecotoxicity and ecotoxicological and environmental fate studies. We talk about ecotoxicity. We're looking at aquatic testing, which would include fish, invertebrates, and algae, and again, freshwater and marine species, and aquatic plants. And there are a lot of different types of invertebrates that you can use for toxicity testing. Daphnia magna are the most common, but there's other things that we can be using. Terrestrial testing, we look at plants, birds, bees, earthworms, and arthropods. And again, there's a lot of different species, and the studies will be chosen by the EPA based upon the potential toxicity and exposure and where they think the pesticide, either as the parent, unchanged, or as a metabolite or a byproduct, where it may ultimately end up. And we use these data in the environmental risk assessment to determine an environmental effect concentration. So we want to determine in the environment how much of this pesticide is not going to be harmful to organisms, so we can make sure that we're not exceeding that in any type of an environmental release. If we look at environmental fate studies, we're considering the biodegradation. So do microorganisms utilize the carbon in these products as a food source and then release carbon dioxide? We can consider hydrolysis. Does it change at different pH over time? We look at soil and sediment metabolism. Absorption, does it stay absorbed to certain things? And we're always concerned with activated sled studies, because you don't want your pesticide to end up in a wastewater treatment plant and then it kills the microbes in the sludge, and now you have an ineffectual wastewater treatment plant, and you don't want to get that call, because you don't want to be that guy that ends up causing a huge upset at the wastewater treatment plant. They get really worked up about that. And then bioconcentration, we want to know, is this going to stay in the trophic levels? Is it going to move up the food chain? Does it go into a pond and it ends up in the algae, and it ends up in vertebrates, and it ends up in fish? And then next thing you know, you read on the news that it's showed up in bald eagles. I mean, you don't want that. And then again, we're interested nowadays, especially in Europe, with endocrine testing. Does it have an effect on the endocrine system? I mean, we've all heard about the issue with frogs and amphibians and in fish with the changing of the sexes and things like that. We don't want to have any of those types of problems. And we do see some chemicals that can be problematic. So EPA is going to evaluate the potential for the active ingredient to persist in the environment. That's what the FATE tests are doing. How long is it going to persist? Is it going to biodegrade or mineralize through biodegradation into carbon dioxide and water? We don't end up with anything that's toxic. Is it going to persist in a wastewater treatment plant? So we can't use that sludge to put on the land surfaces, do we have to make sure it's handled as a hazardous waste? So we have to know where these chemicals end up in the environment. For human health, we have what's called a 6-pack, and I didn't include this in the last slide for Ecotox, but for Ecotox, we always do an acute 3-pack. When we do acute studies, we do an algal study in Daphnia magna and then a fish, and that's our 3 trophic levels. For human health testing, we have a 6-pack, and so we look at toxicity, the oral toxicity, we look at it dermally, and we look at inhalation. And then we look at irritation through eyes, skin, and then we look at skin sensitization as well. So these are standard 6-pack. There's information that EPA is always going to expect to see when we're considering human health. And these provide the initial data that ultimately lead to the classification and any precautionary labeling for hazards and for PPE on the SDS. So these are very crucial endpoints or data to have for registration. There are subchronic studies that are conducted, again, as EPA looks at these products or these active ingredients. They'll make judgments about what type of additional data has to be generated based upon exposure and potential for toxicity. Subchronics are are conducted as repeated exposures over a limited period of time. They could be 28 days or 90 days repeated dose in a variety of species. Again, this is human health, so we'll be looking at mice, rats, and rabbits. Sometimes you have to do them all. It'll be multiple routes of exposure, so we can expose them orally, dermally, and do inhalation studies. And then these studies are going to look at body and organ weights, and then we're also going to be a necropsy at the end of them to look at organ and tissue health. So it's and you have to have a specialist for that, somebody that's trained with pathology to be able to look at the weights and then the actual organs themselves to determine, is there any damage that we can see from these active ingredients. We have genotoxicity studies. We also are required to conduct these as well. These are studies that are done in petri dishes and test tubes. Genotoxicity looks at damage to DNA and chromosomes. So we have an Ames test. There's an in vitro mammalian mutagenicity test, chromosome aberration. So when we talk about genotoxicity, we're talking about DNA and chromosomes as well. When we talk about mutagenicity, we're talking specifically about changes to DNA. And then we have chronic testing to evaluate long-term effects. These would look at developmental impairment and damage or changes to reproductive organs or fecundity, which is reproduction, right? Number of offspring produced. These can be multi-generational development and reproductive testing. So we could be looking at effects in fetuses. So you can expose parents prior to mating, or you can expose them, you can expose pregnant females as well. And you want to evaluate the pesticide exposure, how it affects reproduction. So you would look at the mother plus the pups to see how well they're developing. There's neurotoxicity testing, would look at the potential to have effects on the nervous system. Ultimately, do you have damage to neurons and things like that, which can lead to death, or do you just have some type of neurological impairment? Mutagenicity testing will assess the potential effect on cells' genetic material or DNA. So we're interested in how the DNA may change. I included endocrine assays here as well because there's a battery of 11 different endocrine assays, and they start out fairly simple in a test tube, and they work their way up to fish and frogs, and they ultimately, there are mammalian tests, endocrine tests as well. So there's quite a few of them. And then cancer studies are the longest duration and most expensive studies to conduct. When we were talking about the EPA risk paradigm, we were talking about the dose response assessment. So when EPA is looking at the toxicity data developed from or determined from the environmental or ecotox studies and the human health studies, again, if it's an LD50, it's a lethal dose to 50% of the organisms. but EPA will take that information and the Registrar too will also provide this information. It'll be a DNAIL. It's a derived no effect level, and this would be the level above which humans should not be exposed. So this DNAIL it's a difficult calculation, and it's very specific that we're not supposed to see any concentrations or levels above the DNAIL if we want to prevent any type of adverse human health effects. For the environment, again, we're generating a no observed effect concentration or adverse effect level, so a NOEL or NOAC, and then a LOEL or a LOAC. We take that information as well, and we ultimately get a PNEC. So we've got a DNAIL for human health. We have a PNEC, which is a predicted no effect concentration. It's the same thing. We're not seeing an effect of that concentration. We don't want to see concentrations in the environment that go above that PNEC. But the EPA is going to take that DNAIL, and they're going to develop, it's actually considered the dose response relationship, so because you can see the graph. But they'll take that DNAIL and they'll adjust it for the average human body weight and some other factors, and they'll end up with a dose response assessment, which I'll include here in a minute. It goes in the risk assessment. So now we'll step into exposure. Because we've already talked about hazards. So we have acute and chronic testing. We develop those or determine those data. We'll calculate a PNEC. We'll also calculate an environmental effect concentration, and we'll get a PNEC, a DNAIL, and an EEC. But we have to consider exposure, because remember, risk is equal to hazard or the toxicity and potential exposure. So risk from exposure is affected by several different things. One of them is fairly intuitive, so it's individual overall health. So your age, your gender, if you have allergies, you have underlying health conditions, or you're a pregnant female, this can all have an effect, or all can influence the effect that you may have by being exposed to a chemical. Obviously, if you're in poor health, you may experience more severe effects than someone who's younger and healthier. Emphasis is given in risk assessments to protect the susceptible populations. So children and pregnant women are the populations that we're really trying to protect, and they can be more susceptible to the effects of exposure. Duration, how long is the exposure? Is it an hour, days? Are you living next to something and being exposed, days, weeks, years? Frequency, is it a single or repeated exposure? The concentration, and it's expressed in ppm, parts per million or parts per billion, and the dose. And the dose is actually the amount of the substance that enters the body, and it's usually adjusted for body weight. So the dose is really important, and not all doses of toxin or a substance are harmful. So I'll just throw this in there because it fits here. But if you were taking enough aspirin, you can have an adverse effect. If you are exposed to too much sodium chloride, again, you can have an effect. Oxygen can be toxic at high concentrations. Apple seeds, when you smash them up, release small amounts of cyanide, but we eat apples all the time, and you never really hear about anybody having an effect, right, from eating apples. So really, it comes back to gonna move along here. All right, seem to be dead in the water for a moment. Thank you. It comes back to the dose makes the poison. You probably have heard this. It's an old saying that goes back hundreds of years. And it's a big thing when we talk about BPA, because BPA poses no health risk to consumers because current exposure to the chemical is too low to cause harm. Although, we've seen this big push over the last few years to eliminate BPA exposure because of a lot of research that really wasn't that good, that's since been defunct. But BPA is really, in small quantities, in small concentrations, it's not harmful, and we don't really see a lot of potential for harm through exposure. But then it's been replaced by BPS, which is really very similar, but has not become a concern to the public, at least at this point. And then on the right, it shows some of the lethal doses of common chemicals. And you may have already seen this slide today. You may see it again because we use it a lot because I think it's fairly intuitive. So, and these are estimates. Again, individual health is going to be one of the biggest things that determines your potential for an effect from exposure. So 6 liters of water for some people can be toxic and cause some health effects. 118 cups of coffee for some people because of the caffeine. 13 shots of alcohol. I don't know anybody personally that can take 13 shots of alcohol, but you know, there may be. And but alcohol, we all know alcohol can be toxic. You hear about alcohol poisoning all the time. So in small amounts, it's not harmful. In larger amounts, it is. So the dose makes the poison. Routes of exposure. So obviously inhalation is a big one. It's through the lungs. We have dermal exposure. This is contact or absorption through the skin. So not only can you get just a dermal exposure where you get a rash or burning sensation, but it can actually be absorbed through the skin, and you can experience other systemic effects from that. And then of course ingestion, and the eyes. The eyes are very similar to dermal exposure, that you can have eye damage or you can actually have absorption through the eye into the body. The route of exposure will be dictated by the type and the use of the pesticide. Obviously, if it's something you're spraying, you have a lot more of a potential for not just dermal exposure, but inhalation as well. Dermal exposure is the most common for applicators, right? But inhalation exposure, although it's less common, it can pose the most serious health risk. You can jump in the shower, the safety shower, if you've been dermally exposed and rinse it off, you know, remove your clothing, and but it's a lot more difficult when it's been inhaled into your lungs. There's really no way to remove it. You really have to work with the symptoms and not try to get it out of there, because you really can't. So now we'll kind of step into the human health risk assessment. So it's a 4-step process. So we do the hazard identification, which is we looked at the toxicity, and we've already talked about that, of both the active ingredient and the formulated product, both important. They'll calculate, or we calculate, a dose response assessment. So we're looking at the exposure and effects, and then you're doing a numerical calculation, and you're looking at this relationship. So you're looking at, if we got data from fish, you know, what is that going to mean for humans? And so they end up with this dose response assessment. Again, they look at exposure, frequency, timing, level of contact. You end up with the risk characterization. Again, this is that paradigm that the EPA has. And you get a risk characterization, which is describing the overall risk, and they're going to apply some safety factors. And then we end up, as a goal, risk management. So this is going to end up on the SESs as hazard warnings, on the labels, PPE requirements. It could be restrictions and volumes. So not only does the EPA want to make sure that the proper information is going on the labels and on the SESs, so you're using them safely, you know what PPE to wear, how to handle them, what to do in an emergency. That's really important, and a lot of the information from the toxicity testing drives that. But the EPA has to make a definitive determination about risk for the registration, and they can limit, you know, what volume is produced each year. They can limit its use. They can limit its application. A human health risk assessment can determine this is a true story actually, a high risk for inhalation toxicity during commercial use of handheld spray equipment. And the EPA did restrict this end use for this particular product that I'm thinking about. And they only allowed brush on applications, or you're going to have to wear a full face respirator. A lot of people don't want to wear a full face respirator. So in this case, it was easier to limit the use and just not have it be a use on the label. So you just eliminated handheld spray equipment, and it was supposed to be used for brush on applications only. So, but that was the risk that EPA identified. It was an inhalation hazard, and they wanted to mitigate that as much as possible. So if we're talking about pesticide exposure, again, we can have these contact adverse effects, right? So you can have a dermal exposure, you can get a rash or a burn to the skin. Hopefully, you know, if you're observing this or you're feeling this, you're immediately jumping in the safety shower, taking the effective mitigation steps, because you can result in dermal absorption into deeper tissue. So not only do you want not to have the rash or the burn, but you want to make sure you're getting this material off you as quickly as possible. We can see systemic adverse effects. So we can see a localized exposure that spreads to other parts of the body or organs in the body as well. So again, you just think of it as dermal exposure. Well, you can have a systemic effect as well. So you want to make sure that you're addressing any type of exposure properly. You can have allergic adverse effects, and these can be contact or systemic. Again, so it could just be limited to the area of exposure, or you can have a full out, go into anaphylaxis. So you can rash, hives, itching, can't breathe, You can become sensitized only after one exposure, and allergic adverse effects are not dose dependent. People will react to exposure differently. So you may think, you're not really allergic to it, but you may be. And poison ivy is a good example of this. And some people say they're not allergic to the oil, but pretty much everybody is. And the more that you're exposed to it, you can become sensitized to it. I just have to look at it, and I get poison ivy now. But when I was a kid, I didn't really get it very often. It was always limited. But so you need to be aware of your exposure and potential for an allergic reaction. This one didn't come out quite the way that it was supposed to, but on the left screenshot here, this came from the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, and this is presented in a lot of different ways from a lot of different agencies. And it shows mild poisoning symptoms on the left, and they're more severe in the middle column. And then by the time you get over to the right, you really don't have a choice, I think, to identify that you're having some type of a problem that's most likely based upon exposure to some type of a chemical, because you can't breathe, and you're really having some very, very serious reactions. But it's important to keep in mind that when you're working with these pesticides, that you don't want to mistake a common symptom such as allergies, for having been exposed. So you always want to make sure that you're aware of any potential exposure. And because you're sneezing or you're itchy and you're thinking, well, I'm having allergies today, you may want to just consider that, you may have been exposed, and you may just want to pay attention to your work environment and think about any incident that you may have just not really taken too seriously. By the time we get in the middle, obviously you're having symptoms that are probably going to keep you from working. So again, you need to make sure that you're just observant when you're working with these materials if you experience any of these health issues. So hazards of wood preservatives, again, they're pesticides, right? They're used to treat a pest. We don't want to be seeing that these wood products are being attacked by various pests. But toxicity is going to be determined by the specific active ingredient, right? They're not all of these active ingredients are the same. That's why we have to do testing on them as individuals, and they have such big testing programs and data requirements. The route of exposure is going to depend on contact with a formulated product or the article. Most risk is going to be from personal exposure during the application process, and exposure can take place in a variety of different steps. So handling and mixing chemicals, we see a lot of dermal exposure. Entering pressure treatment cylinders, working around spray or dip operations, if you're handling fresh treated wood, you're cleaning, servicing or equipment. And disposable waste is not something it's not a step that a lot of people consider you're going to be exposed to a pesticide, but it can happen. You need to be careful when you're disposing of any waste material. Make sure that you're reading the labels and the safety data sheets, you bring the correct PPE. Good housekeeping is very important, along with good hygiene, and a lot of housekeeping requirements and PPE requirements may be even more stringent on site and site specific than they are just on the SDS. So just as a kind of a quick example, when you're looking at SDSs and we're talking about active ingredients and formulated products specifically, it's important to keep in mind that we've just talked about all the data that goes into on the SDS, the data that's generated for the risk assessment. Not every bit of information is always on the SDS. You know, a lot of companies will put on what's required, and there's a lot of other information that EPA is using that we don't see to develop risk. But the SDS is going to be your first step at making sure that you understand what you're working with. And if we look at something like the chromated copper arsenate, the CCA, we have data for chromic acid. You can pull up an SDS for chromic acid. You know, trivalent chromium I have listed here. It's an essential trace element in humans. As a pure metal, it has no adverse effects, but chromium as a hexavalent compound is very toxic. And it can cause a variety of effects through inhalation or contact or ingestion, and you get dermatitis and a whole bunch of other things. So hexavalent chromium can be toxic to humans, but you know, again, if it's a trace element, it's not, and it's pure metal, it's not. But you can pull up information for chromic acid, you can pull up information for arsenic acid, and you can pull up information for a variety of copper is copper oxide and a variety of things. But if you're looking at CCA, that SDS is designed to be safe based upon hazards for its individual components. So when we're looking at mixtures, the SDS is going to be conservative, and it's not just going to be based upon whether or not the company tested CCA as a mixture, but it's also going to be based upon the individual components that may be driving toxicity. So, for example, copper has low toxicity to humans, but it can have negative impacts on aquatic organisms. So you may not think anything about copper, but again, we don't want copper released to the environment because it kills aquatic organisms fairly quickly. And then for CCA, the arsenic compound is the most problematic for human health and the environment. So the DNAL, which we talked about DNALs earlier, for arsenic is 12 micrograms per meter cubed for inhalation. So it has an inhalation hazard, and 12 micrograms ppb is a very small amount. So obviously it's very toxic as an inhalation hazard. And then 600 micrograms per kilogram per day or higher has been shown to result in mortality. So realistically, if you're looking at CCA, you know, the arsenic is the component that's problematic. Although, you know, we've got copper to consider for the environment, and you know, if chromium's in the hexavalent form, it can cause some issues as well. But all that has got to be considered on the SDS. And then I did throw in some SDS information for arsenic on here as well. It gets an acute aquatic 1, which is the lowest. It's a chronic, and again, these are all hazard statements and classifications that the EPA puts on there that go back to very specific endpoints and ranges where they'll incorporate these hazards. Anything that's 1 is not good, and a 2 is not great, and 3 is not too bad, so 1 is the worst. So this is getting a 1. For acute toxicity for inhalation, it's getting a 3, but it's considered toxic by inhalation if swallowed. And I included some of the pictograms up here as well. So if you looked at it, it would get the skull and crossbones, which is an indication to you that this can be very toxic. The dead fish, dead tree on the left is for the environment. There are 9 of these pictograms. Only 8 of them have to be on there if they apply to that specific active ingredient or formulated product. The environmental one is voluntary. You don't have to put it on there, which I think is crazy. But so you may not see dead fish, dead tree, but you will see the warning statements where it says very toxic to aquatic organisms that can cause a long-term adverse effect. But it's very important for you to at least recognize the pictograms, and the warning statements are meant to be easily interpreted. So, and I'm not going to go through these SDSs. Obviously, you're familiar with them. You know, we get the hazard classifications in section 2. You get composition in section 3. So you can look on here, and this is for CCA. You can see the different components. They're very small, but yet arsenic was driving excuse me, some of the hazard, but it's important to be able to interpret them and understand their meaning. So hopefully this was helpful, that you kind of now have a little bit of better understanding of what the EPA requires for data, and what that data ultimately, or where it ultimately ends up in the SDS or in the risk assessment, and that how it's meant to protect human health and the environment. And I encourage you to make sure that you're reading the labels, you're reading the SDSs. If there's not enough information there, that you're going back as a customer and asking for more information to make sure that you're working safely. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Does anybody have any further questions they could send in to Sarah? Okay. Couple notes here. Our next speaker is Terry Moko, and Terry will be talking to us about pesticide labeling and PPE requirements. But first, we're going to have a poll question, number 4. EPA risk assessments fall into 2 categories, environmental and human health. True or false? Sarah, how are we looking on that response?
We are at 76%.
Okay, we'll give everybody a little bit more time to respond.
It's climbing slowly but surely. We're at 83%.
Okay, I think we need to move on to our next presenter, who I mentioned. There will be a poll question at the end of Terry's presentation, and then following that, we'll take a break, 15-minute break. But a little bit about Terry. She joined LSI in 2014 and now serves as Senior Manager of Regulatory Affairs Americas. Terry has nearly 30 years of regulatory experience with wood preservatives. Her responsibilities include securing and managing pesticide registrations in the Americas and ensuing compliance with all applicable pesticide regulations in these regions. Terry is a longtime participant of the American Chemistry Council, Biocides Panel, and Panel Task Forces. Terry is chair of the Acinical Wood Preservers Task Force and an active member of the Antimicrobial Exposure Assessment Task Force 2, and as well as the Copper Task Force. Terry has a Bachelor of Arts degree from State University of New York in Communications and Political Science, and her topic is Pesticide Labeling and PPE Requirements. Terry, welcome.
Thank you, Grady.
Excuse me, Terry, let me break in 1 second. After your
Sure.
presentation, Terry, we'll have Michael Collins, and then we'll have a break.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Let's see. Okay, so I have control. Glad everyone could join us today. My topic is on pesticide labeling, and I tried to, if you've attended the past couple of years, I don't want you to think, oh no, this is the same presentation. I tried to mix it up a little for you this year, and in addition to talking about how we should safely and legally handle our pesticide products based on the label instructions, I'm going to touch on what is considered a pesticide label, the relationship between the label and the product registration. And something a little new we're going to talk about is what causes a label to be revised. We're always telling you, read your label because they change. So why does a label change? You know, what can influence it? What changes are there? And what changes could you expect soon? There's been some talk already today about EPA's re-registration and risk assessments and a lot of work that's being done by the agency. And you know, how is that going to impact labels, the products that you're using, and even your work practices? So we're going to touch a little bit on that. So what is a pesticide label? In regards to EPA's definitions, they have a definition for a label, and then they have a definition for labeling. So the label is what you would typically think of the label. It's what's going to be on the tote, or it's going to be on your storage drum, or if pesticides in your home, it's going to be on your bottle of disinfectant. It's usually attached right to the product packaging, or it's printed directly onto the product packaging, and includes a lot of text and images. And we'll go over the different parts in a little bit, but that's what we consider the label. Now, labeling, in regards to EPA definition, is not only the product label, but it could be a booklet or a manual if the label references a manual, or if it references a booklet. Then that becomes part of EPA's responsibility, and they'll regulate that. Lots of times you'll get, especially when if you were to purchase a pesticide, say a lawn care type product to use around your home, it may have like a little like a hang tag type label attached to it that has, you open it up and it's got a lot of directions, usually written in very small print that's hard to read. But that's considered labeling. It accompanies the label, and it's regulated by EPA and needs to be approved by EPA. The SDS is officially considered part of the labeling. The reason EPA does not regulate the language on the SDS is because there's an exemption for that document, and is that as long as the SDS doesn't say anything in conflict with the label, or if it does have different hazard classifications, and Michael Collins will go into the various classifications that are on an SDS. If there are statements on an SDS based on GHS classification that differs from the label, then that is stated in one section towards the end of the SDS. And for that reason, EPA does not review and approve every SDS for a registered pesticide product. So all pesticide products are registered by US EPA, and has been mentioned that it's under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, which we refer to as FIFRA. Registrants will prepare an application for registration, and they'll submit it to EPA with, they have all their necessary forms. They'll have product chemistry work that's done on the end-use product. The product that you end up receiving at your plant will have had all kinds of physical and chemical characteristic testing done under what EPA refers as good laboratory practice standards, or GLP. And it will also have most likely acute toxicity studies that are done on that individual product. I said most likely because if there's a similar product that's already registered with EPA that is possible to cite that data, then it's preferable if you can cite data, just in the interest of more tox testing means more testing on animals, and you try to avoid that if necessary. You don't want to duplicate tests for very similar products. And also you run the risk of those results coming out differently, and then that can cause a lot of questions and problems. But typically, when we're getting ready to register a new product, we'll have done internally, we'll have done all the research needed to refine the formulation. We've done the product chemistry testing, we've done the acute toxicity, we have all the forms needed, the formulation, everything we're going to provide to EPA, we submit as our application package. And then EPA will take that information on the product to assess the risk if the use is proposed on the draft label, because we're going to give them with all that information, the draft label. And we're going to explain to EPA, this is how we're going to use the product, this is what we're going to use it for, how it's going to be applied, and at what doses. And then we also, for example, when I'm drafting a label to send to EPA with an application, I'll look at the data, and based on guidance documents from EPA, I'll prepare the precautionary statements and any type of Ppe requirements based off that information. So I'll put that all together as a draft label and give that to EPA. So EPA is going to use all this data, and they're going to assess the risk of the use of the uses proposed on the draft label. If they don't find any unacceptable risk, then the registration will be granted. And everything that we've been talking about today that goes into supporting a registration, everything Becky just told you about all the testing on active ingredients and all the data that goes in to studying chemicals that are used as pesticide products, everything we're doing internally for efficacy to prove that it works. You as the user don't see that, but what you do see is that label. That's really the visual representation of the registration, because that is what you see when it shows up at your plant. Unlike other labels that you may be on a product, pesticide labels are legally enforceable, and all of them carry the statement, it's a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. And what that means, if you're caught using a product, for example, if with our CCA label, with all our arsenical labels from all, not only from the Archwood arsenical label, but our competitors' labels too, all have specific uses for CCA and what commodities can be treated. If it was found out that you were treating wood for a use that's not allowable according to the product label, then that's enforceable, and that's an offense under FIFRA for that plant. If someone is using a chemical like, well, we know this chemical X this label says it's for this purpose, but we know it will work for this other reason too. You can't just use it if it doesn't say it on the label, because again, it's enforceable. You have to follow the label, and you have to follow the rates on the label. Those rates are there for a reason. Those are the rates of application that have been assessed for risk according to the exposure based on the use of the product. So if you were to use it at a higher level than what's previously been assessed, then you're putting yourself and the environment in harm's way by using it at a level that's not on the label. So again, the label is very important. So when I go ahead and get ready to draft a pesticide label, I need to know what active ingredients and the percentages are in the composition, because that's going to be on the label. I need to know whether or not toxicity tests have been done and what the results of those tests are. I'm going to look at the results of those tests to determine the tox classification. Is it going to have caution, warning, or danger on the label? This is based on the tox test. One, EPA does have available on their website a document called the Label Review Manual, and everybody that drafts pesticide labels references this document when writing a label, because you can look in there and there's a table that will say if these are the tox results you have, this is the tox classification that should be on the label. It also is a guide, because you use that same data to determine what precautionary language and personal protective equipment requirements need to be on the label. Also, I would need to know if the product's physical and chemical characteristics information provide results that we need to warn of on the label. Is this product that we're going to register flammable? because that will require certain language on the label. Is it an oxidizer? Do we have to warn against storage with other chemicals? So that's that information is important because those are statements that could end up on the product label. What are the intended use sites? Is it for pressure treatment only? Is it for both pressure treatment and surface treatment? Can it be dipped? Can it be sprayed? We have to specify on the label where the use sites are and the methods of application. You cannot apply a product in a manner that's not specified on the label. And this goes back to the hazardous assessments that Becky was talking about, because EPA has looked at the manner in which a product is applied, and then they use exposure information that they have on that method of application and along with tox data to calculate risk. So if you use it in a manner that's not described on the label, then it's a situation which may not have a risk assessment associated with it. So again, you can put yourself be causing harm to yourself or the environment. I need to know the container sizes. How are we going to ship this product? Are we going to do, is it just bulk? Is it going to be totes? Is it going to be 55-gallon drums? Is it going to be a 5-gallon PAL? Because that affects the storage and disposal and container handling statements that are on the product label. So I need to gather all this information before I can draft a label and send it to EPA along with an application for registration. Now, there's different types of product labels. What you see is typically, what you're going to see at the plant is an end-use product label. Now, an end-use product label is one that specifies exactly how that product can be used. You're normally looking at like a manufacturing concentrate that is you're going to dilute on site, which you typically do with wood preservatives. And then you're going to apply by a specific method stated on the label. And or else it could be a ready-to-use type product that is, for example, if any of you are familiar with the remedial side of wood preservation, most of those products are ready to use. They're just going to take a paste out of a bucket and apply it to a pole. Or an end-use product would be an example, would be, the sprays and the bug sprays you have at home would be end use. A manufacturing use product or a technical active or labels for products that are going to be used to make registered end-use products. For example, whereas we have our CCA end-use registration, we also have a registration for arsenic acid, we have a registration for copper oxide, and we have a registration for chromic acid. But those are technical products that can only be used at a site that's producing a registered pesticide product. And there's differences in the labels. A manufacturing use or a technical active, a label for one of those products will not have the PPE instructions that would be typically found on an end-use product. It may not have all the same requirements because it's going to be used in a manufacturing facility to formulate another pesticide. It's going to simply state that that's what the purpose of the label is. It won't have dosage and various methods of application on it because it's only going to be used to produce another pesticide. So those are typically the types of product labels that the EPA reviews. So the parts of the pesticide product label, we have what EPA refers to as the primary panel. And for our products, the Archwood or Arch Treatment Technology product labels are all formatted the same in that the primary panel is the center panel on a 3-column or a 3-panel label. So in the center would be what we consider the primary panel. If you were to look at perhaps something in your home, like say a small can or a spray bottle, the primary panel would be the front and portion of the container. It has usually will have the product name and the other, label elements listed here, whereas the back side would have what we consider secondary panel information. So for the primary panel, that is where you'll find your restricted use statement. If the product is restricted use, it's going to be right at the very top of your primary panel, followed by the product name and the ingredient statement. Now, all labels will have a child hazard warning statement to keep out of reach of children, followed by the signal word. And as I mentioned, it's going to be danger, warning, or caution. Or in some cases, it will also have the skull and crossbones symbol in the word poison in combination with the danger signal word. And again, these will all be on the primary panel of the label. The first aid statement will be on the primary panel. For the products that you see, that's where it will be located. Depending on if it's a lower class hazard in terms of classification, in a consumer product, the first aid statement in some cases can be on the secondary panel. Lots of times there isn't enough room on the primary panel, and EPA does allow in certain circumstances for it to be on the secondary panel. For our labels, you'll also find the net contents on the primary panel. And for net contents, what we're trying to, EPA has become a little more stricter on is that if a product is a liquid product, the net contents should be in liquid measurements. If it's a solid, it will be in weight, the mass units. It gets a little difficult because typically, as you know, we sell our products in terms of weight, and we don't typically sell in terms of, say, gallons. But that is something we're trying to become more aware of, and to make sure that our labels correctly reflect the net contents in regards to the physical state of the product. Just wanted to go over the restricted use statement, because that is why the reason most of you are attending for your credits for your licenses that are required to either purchase or apply restricted use pesticide products. And this is the restricted use statement from the CCA label, and it states restricted use pesticide due to acute toxicity, and because this product contains arsenic and chromium compounds, which may be associated with tumor development in humans and is considered to have an acute toxicity level. This product is not for retail sale and can only be used by certified applicators holding a current state certification for pesticide applications or under the direct supervision. It must be used strictly in accordance with this label. I think that explains what a restricted use pesticide is. There are requirements in regards to how it looks on the label. It needs to be at the very top of the primary panel. It has to be enclosed in a box, as this one is. And the requirements are that the headings say restricted use pesticide, a reason for why it is restricted use, and that's what we have stated here, and a summary of the statement of the terms of restriction. So what is restricted, and that is that you need to have state certification. For our products, you'll see this restricted use classification on the CCA or the ACCA labels. If you have worked in the past in a plant, or even currently work in a plant that treats also, in addition to CCA, either pentochlorophenol or creosote, they are also restricted use pesticide products. Now, secondary panels of a pesticide label is where you'll find your precautionary statements. And by precautionary statements, you'll have this signal word repeated. For example, if the main signal word is danger, it will say that again in your precautionary statements. And then it will tell you what it's a danger to. For example, danger may be fatal if inhaled or harmful if ingested. It will provide various statements. It may say, you know, something along the lines that may cause serious eye damage. Those are what we call precautionary statements. Also language in regards to you know, eating or drinking, you know, while using the wash your hands after use of the product and before eating or drinking, and just precautionary statements in regards to keeping you safe when you're using the product. Hazards to humans and domestic animals. It will again provide all your hazards to the humans, and then also your environmental health hazards, which typically are something along the lines that this product is toxic to fish or aquatic life. And then it will provide you some warnings in regards to discharge of the product or rinsate from the product. If there are any physical and chemical hazards, again, associated with the product, if it's flammable, is it an oxidizer. Not all labels have physical and chemical hazards on their label, but if the hazards exist, then it will be stated. On the secondary panel, you'll also find your personal protective equipment requirements. Long sleeves, some examples of, wearing long sleeves, long pants, chemical resistant gloves, footwear, protective eyewear such as goggles or face shield. Those are the type of requirements that you would find for under the PPE. And sorry, that skull and crossbones symbol, that should be over, that should have been on the last slide. So that was that's on your primary panel. Secondary panel would have your directions for use. It'll tell you exactly how you can apply the product, what rates you can apply the product, if you need specific equipment, especially when it comes in regards to a treating plant. For example, the CCA label references specific type of door closures or rails for and how to operate the doors. That would all be under your directions for use. And storage and disposal statements are on the secondary panel. And again, that is not only how to dispose of the product, but also how to handle a container that had product in it. If pesticide products require triple rinsing of containers, and it will explain on the label how to do that triple rinsing and how to handle the rinsate from that rinsing. So now I want to talk a little bit about pesticide labels changing. And I know in past years we've always mentioned that, if you should make sure you read a product and don't take for granted, read a product label and don't take for granted that it's the same year in and year out, because they do change. They can change for multiple reasons, but typically the changes are either initiated by the registrant themselves, or they're required by EPA or another state agency regulating pesticides. Typically, when I refer to another state agency, it's the state of California. It's not uncommon to submit a label to the state of California, and they want some language that's different from what EPA has already approved. And so you often have to go back to EPA, get their approval on the change to the label, and then go back to California to get a registration. In the past, that has been the main state that would have any issues with product labels that EPA had already approved. Some examples of registrant-initiated label changes could be if we want to add or delete a use site. If we want, for example, if you had or change in an application rate. Some examples could be like, for example, a label could have only been for pressure treatment, but we want to add uses for surface applied treatments such as dip or spray. Or maybe they have all three and we've decided we don't want to market it further, or have it used for dip or spray and we just want pressure treated. Any change like that to the label, you have to go back in and get permission from EPA to change the label. We may want to change the mix instructions. We might want to add instructions for mixing with other preservatives, or we want to maybe change the ratio of how a product should be mixed. Those are instances where the registrant has decided that they want to go in and make a change, and so they go into EPA and get permission for the change. And then again, once EPA approves of change, then the label then would have to be updated in all the states in which the product's distributed. Now, EPA can also require changes on a product label. And these are usually the result of a policy or a rule change on the part of EPA, or a result of an agency review of an active or a group of products, which is currently EPA's main focus right now is the registration review process, which is going to result probably for every product you use some type of change on a product label. In the past, a common practice from EPA was to issue what they called pesticide registration notices, or PR notices. And this was their way of requiring across-the-board label changes for all registrants at the same time. This is more common years ago than it has been in the more recent past. For example, in 2017, they issued a couple of notices, PR notices, that were relative to labels, and they were for agricultural uses. And but if you go back to 2007, it was actually a PR notice that resulted in changes on every product that you use, and that was for the labeling revisions for the in the storage and disposal handling statements of a product label. Everyone had it to do the changes at the same time, where everybody was on the same timeline to update that section of their label to be consistent with some new regulations that EPA had passed. Back in 2001, everyone updated their first aid statements. Again, when EPA issued a PR notice and said, all registrants, if you need to make these changes by this date, your label should reflect these changes. I actually prefer EPA doing the PR notices, because then everyone stays on a level playing field in terms of their labels, because the change is being made across the board for all chemicals at the same time. Unfortunately, EPA, as I said, has gotten away from that practice, and most changes now on labels are coming as a result of registration reviews, and it depends on what actives are hit first in terms of the review process that results in that label being changed perhaps before another one. So even though eventually all labels will have the changes on them, they tend to hit at different times. Now, in regards to the registration review process, Becky showed you a similar chart that describes the process. And I'm going to relate this also to the CCA registration review. What EPA did is that you may remember they had re-registration. And then after re-registration, they started what they called the registration review process, which is a 15-year cycle that every 15 years, products will go through a review process. And we're actually nearing the end of that first 15-year cycle. It will be done October 1st of 2022. EPA is supposed to be done with their initial registration review process. It's not, we don't think they're going to make their deadline. COVID has affected that somewhat, but also the fact that what EPA did is they did all what they considered the easy reviews first and saved all the hard ones to the end, and now they have a lot of work to deal with, and then impacted by COVID at the same time. So when EPA is doing a registration review process, they issue a preliminary work plan, and then the public can comment on that preliminary work plan. And actually for CCA, the registrants, we read the preliminary work plan, and initially EPA was going to request some data on inhalation exposure when sawing wood, and they were actually going to look for a study for exposure of honeybees to the wood, to the treated wood itself. And the Arsenical Wood Preservatives Task Force commented on that preliminary work plan, and we provided reasons why we felt those additional studies were not necessary based on the data that already existed for this chromated arsenicals. And so when the final work plan was issued, those data requirements were taken out. So we were successful in our comment period. And because those data requirements were taken out of the final work plan, a data call-in was not issued. In most products, I think most chemicals have had data call-ins issued, which required additional data to be generated, whether it been some type of tox or environmental or exposure. But we were lucky with the chromated arsenicals that we did not have to generate any additional data to support the registration review process. which allowed us then to skip the DCI phase of the review process and go into the draft risk assessment. A draft risk assessment was issued, and again, the registrants commented on it, and we felt we were mostly successful in terms of our comments and EPA listening to us, and they issued a proposed interim final decision document with some proposals they thought would need to be done to mitigate risk that they felt existed in regards to their draft risk assessment that was conducted. We provided comments on the proposed interim decision, and the next step was an interim final decision, which EPA is saying they may have out by the end of the year, but we're not sure. It could be beginning of the first quarter of next year. What they're trying to do too is keep all heavy-duty wood preservatives, CCA, creosote, and penta, on the same time schedule in terms of issuing these decision documents. And this is just kind of a list of the various actives of registration of wood preservatives, that are in the registration review process, and they're all in different phases in terms of whether a draft risk assessment or the proposed interim decision still being anticipated, or an interim decision. So EPA is looking at these all in different timetables, which again goes back to which I had mentioned. What happens then is when EPA requires a label change, for example, that they say is going to be on all wood preservative products, it will hit the ones that have finished the process first. So what impact do we think will be on the chromated arsenical labels? In the registration review process, EPA assessed the risk of exposure to humans in the environment. And if they determine that there is unacceptable risk, they'll need to mitigate those risks. And these can include, mitigation can be additional PPE, it can be engineering controls, it could be a requirement to reduce application rates. In some cases, for some chemicals, they could eliminate use sites or application methods, or they could restrict products. Any of these type of actions are going to result in a change on a pesticide label. EPA will propose label revisions in the PID, which they have done for the chromated arsenicals. And then they'll, in the ID, they will will have the required label amendments. And then once that document's issued, registrants have 60 days from publication to submit revised labels to EPA for approval. And then after EPA approves the revised labels, that label will then need to be submitted to all states in which the product is registered. And then the label is typically activated by companies once all state approvals are received. What drives us in terms of when we'll start using that label is going to be the state of California, since they take the longest to review any changes on a product label. Typically by the time the state of California reaches approves of that label, then we'll be ready to start using it for all our shipments. So what changes can you expect to see after? So I would say if the ID is issued by the end of the year or the beginning of the next year, and then we submit that revised label to EPA, it will take them some time to review it and for us to get it back and then to submit to the states. You most likely, if any changes, if we were on that timetable, you would most likely not see any changes on any products coming to your plant, I would say until late 2022 or possibly even early 2023. So EPA for all wood preservatives is going to require that the application method be clearly stated. If it's pressure treatment, brush, roller, spray. Some wood preservative labels are kind of vague, and EPA is trying to eliminate that across the board. They want labels to list the specific wood commodities to be treated with those preservatives. They want the maximum application rate for each use site wood commodity listed on the label. If you specify that a preservative also is controls termites, you need to have the minimum target retention rate needed for the control of termites. If it's diluted, if the active ingredient is undiluted in the product, like if the product contains nearly 100% of the active ingredient, the minimum target charge retention for each unique commodity use site is required on the label. If the product label references a third-party standard, such as AWPA, which was mentioned earlier today many times, the label has to cite the specific standard. For example, labels can no longer just say follow AWPA guidelines. It would have to specifically state, for example, AWPA U1-19, Section 3. We would have to be very specific in any type of reference to AWPA or remove reference completely. And then both the CCA and the ACCA label will have changes to the PPE requirements. Right now, I can't say for sure what those changes would be. They're not drastic, but we did submit comments to EPA, and we're hoping that they agree with our proposals, and we'll know more when the ID is issued. Any questions?
I don't see any coming in, Terry. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Terry. Michael Collins is going to do the second half of this presentation. And Michael is a Senior Specialist, Environmental Affairs and Product Safety for LSI. He has held this or a similar position since his hire in 2006. In this role, Michael provides EH&S support to Lonza's customer base, and also has responsibilities for developing and maintaining SDSs for LSI wood protection products. Prior to LSI, he served 2 years with MatTech as an environmental consultant and 10 years with Chemical Waste Management as a Southeast Region EH&S manager. He's a U.S. Navy veteran and a graduate of Auburn University with a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science. Michael, you're up.
Thanks, Grady. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to join today. I'm going to talk about PPE requirements, and as you've heard Terry and before her Becky explaining, most of the PPE requirements for our products are driven by the pesticide requirements because most of our products are pesticides. And I am going to show you a label and talk about what PPE is required by that label. But before I get into that, I do want to mention 2 other programs that you are required to comply with that are above and beyond the pesticide requirements. The first is hazard communication. That's a program required by OSHA that requires all employers to have certain elements to meet the standard. They have to have a written program, and that program has to describe what products are on site. You have to have copies of safety data sheets for all those products, and you have to review all of the product labels. And in this case, we're actually talking about non-pesticide products because in this case, we're talking about the GHS labels. So our products either have a GHS label or a pesticide label. But you also, under that program, are required to have a written program and provide training to all your employees, detailing what hazards are associated with each product and what PPE they have to use if they're going to work with those products. So all this training in this program is required under the HAZCOM program. And I do have templates and training programs available specifically for those 2 programs. Just give me a call or shoot me an email, I can send them to you. But that's above and beyond the actual PPE requirements associated just with the pesticide products. The other program I want to mention is the PPE program. This is a different standard by OSHA, but all of these work in conjunction. You have to meet the elements of all of them. That's why I want to mention all of them. Under the PPE program requirements, under that standard, you're also required to have a PPE plan that includes a written hazard assessment for all of your products and all of your job requirements and what PPE is required to perform each of those jobs. So it's a different standard, it's different requirements, it's a different program, But under this program, you also have to have a written program and provide training to your employees on how to use the PPE, what PPE has to be used, and so forth. So again, I have written programs for these, so you just contact me. But all of these work in conjunction with each other to provide overall training to the employees. Now, specifically on PPE itself, I did want to talk about what PPE types there are. And Belinda, I'm not sure I have control. Thank you. So what types of PPE there are. So specifically, we're going to discuss what different types of PPE you might have at your site, including hard hats, eye and face, respiratory, hand, and foot. And talk about each one individually, starting with hard hats. There are 3 general types of hard hats. There's a class G, which is a general. This protects against impact or penetration and also provides low voltage protection up to 2200 volts. You also might see a class E. This is an electrical hard hat. This one's specifically designed for electrical or utility work, but it also protects against falling objects, impacts, and high voltage up to 20,000 volts. And then class C, also known as bump caps, they're really designed for comfort, limited protection, and they protect against bumps, and they don't provide any real protection against falling objects or electrical hazards. So it's important to understand what the different types of hard hats are and to make sure you're using the correct type for the job that's being performed. There are 2 types of eye protection available. First are safety glasses. These provide protection against moderate impacts from particles. And then there's safety goggles. These also provide protection for the eyes, but also some protection of the facial area from impacts, dust, and splashes. So there are 2 different types. Some product labels will require one versus the other. So it's always important to make sure you've read the label, know which one's required, use the proper one. But safety goggles do provide more protection generally than safety glasses do, specifically for splashes or when you're working with liquids. In terms of face protection, the face shield protects face from dust and potential splashes or sprays of liquids, but it's not eye protection. It doesn't protect the eyes. In this case, if eye protection is needed, you would wear safety goggles or safety glasses underneath the face shield. The face shield should not be used as a substitute for the other types of eye protection. It's specifically for face protection. And some of our labels, specifically, I believe the moldicide labels, they might require face protection. So again, always read the label. In terms of respiratory protection, there are 2 main types of respirators. The first is an air purifying respirator. This can be either a full face or a half face, but either one of those types is removing contaminants from the air via some type of filter or cartridge. But it's used in the atmospheric air in that case. The other type is a supplied air respirator. This is one where you would wear a self-contained breathing apparatus or a scuba tank on your back, and that provides clean, breathable air. But either type of these does require a written respiratory protection program and certain training to the employees, and each employee has to be medically evaluated and fit tested prior to using a respirator. So an employee can't just put on a respirator and use it. They have to be trained, you have to have a program, and they have to be qualified to wear a respirator. There are several types of hand protection available. In this case, it's really important to know what type of job is being performed. Most of our chemicals, you would want, obviously, a chemical resistant type glove. But there are several other types on the market: anti-vibration, leather palm, cut resistant, heat resistant, permeation resistant, in some cases might be the best choice. In this instance, always read the label, understand the hazards of the product, going back to the safety data sheet and the label in terms of what PPE is required. Make sure the right gloves are chosen for the job. And also foot protection. There are 2 main types. One are the safety shoes that have a toe cap, a metal toe cap that would protect against falling or rolling objects. And then also rubber shoes would protect against chemical materials. Several types of clothing are available. There could be lab coats, coveralls, vests, jackets, aprons, gowns, or full body suits. And again, the label would specify what is the minimal requirement depending on the pesticide that you're using. And so we've talked about SDSs and we've talked about EPA label requirements. If you're using a pesticide label, we always recommend that you review the label first, and the pesticide label, in this case, is going to take precedence over the SDS. In general, they should agree, but if there's any difference, you would want to follow the EPA label for the registered pesticide. For the unregistered products, follow the requirements of the SDS and the GHS label. But in all cases, make sure you read and follow all label instructions. Here's an example of one of our product labels. You've seen these before, and even today, a couple of examples. The Ppe requirements are usually listed in the left panel, and for each product, it'll detail exactly what Ppe has to be worn for that product. So for example, for copper azole, this is our dissolved copper azole product. It requires coveralls over long sleeve shirt and long pants, socks, chemical resistant footwear, goggles or face shields. So in this case, it lets you make the choice, and chemical resistant gloves, and then an apron when mixing. So, it is pretty specific in terms of what's required, and these are minimums. So you have to at least wear the minimum required PPE. You can add additional PPE, but you have to at least meet the minimums. And OSHA also provides this PPE guide. It's kind of a good example of providing what types of PPE might be needed for certain jobs. So I can send a copy of this to you if you're interested in getting it. OSHA also has it on their website. But specifically here, it lists mostly components in this case, depending on what the chemical is, and it lists several different types of PPE and what works best for some products versus other products. If you're the one making that choice at the facility of what actual glove type you would wear, it helps make that decision easier by providing several examples, and then the ratings, if you see on the chart, they're either fair, good, or very good, or poor. P is poor. So if you look at the one specifically for acetone on the third row, neoprene is a good example. Latex rubber and butyl are very good, so that's the best choice, but nitrile in this case is poor. So if you're working with acetone, you'd probably want to choose the latex rubber or the butyl. So it just provides a guide to help you know how to choose the best types of gloves for any specific job or what chemical you're going to use. I can provide those if you're interested in reviewing those, and always keep in mind, always read the label first. This is the minimum PPE that is required, and LSI people are available to help with any choices that you need. Just always give us a call or let us know how we can help. And that's it for that section.
Thank you, Mike. We'll
Sure.
move right on to poll question number 5. All pesticide products are registered by the US EPA. True or false?
We're at 73%, Grady.
Okay, we'll wait a few more seconds.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll.
Okay. Well, it's time for a break. It's 2:50 p.m. Eastern time. So why don't we come back about 3:05 for our last speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Grady.
Josh, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can.
Michael has another presentation before you
Okay.
about, it says 3:15 to 4:15. So you got another hour plus
Oh,
before you're up.
I thought I was 3 to 4, so okay,
You're,
works for me.
it says here 4:15 to 4:15 to 5:15. You need an hour?
I don't have to have an hour.
Well, that's the time allotted to you.
Okay.
So you can stay up there as long as you want.
Okay. Well, I bet at 5:15 you'll start seeing a bunch of people start dropping off. So
Yeah.
I'll try to keep it before that. Okay.
Okay. Sounds great.
All right.
How have you been doing?
Oh, doing pretty good. How about you?
Doing okay.
That's good, man. That's real good.
Heck in there. I was at the AWPA last week.
Yeah, I was going to be there. My grandfather had to go in the hospital, and he's out now, but he's on hospice here at the house. So we're
Ooh,
yeah, we're trying to take care of him now. And
I understand.
yeah,
I will, I'll be praying for him to have a peaceful time.
thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. My dad was 3 years ago. They did the same thing. He was at home and they give you some good medications, that's for sure,
Yeah.
because he was comfortable to the very end.
Mm-hmm.
He had lymphoma.
Mm.
All right, I'll let you go.
Okay.
Eric's trying to get hold of me.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
All right, well, I guess we can go ahead and get started with the next topic. This is hazardous waste management. Get the slide to advance. All right, so in this section, we're going to cover general hazardous waste requirements, what you have to do at the plant to comply. That includes some information about accumulation requirements, inspections, programs, and reporting. And as you've heard me talk about before, there's also a new rule that went into effect a few years ago called the Generator Improvements Rule. In this presentation, where those requirements are referenced, they will be noted in green. So if you see something on the slide that's green, that's a new requirement under this new rule. All right, so getting into the requirements. What used to be called a conditionally exempt small quantity generator is now known as a very small quantity generator. That is a new name. It means the same thing. It means a generator that generates less than 220 pounds in a calendar month. Very small quantity generator has very limited requirements. There's not much they actually have to do in terms of compliance. The next level up is a small quantity generator. That's a generator that generates more than 220 pounds, but less than 2,200 pounds in a calendar month. And then the last category is a large quantity generator, and they generate greater than 2,200 pounds in a month. So keep in mind, there's a couple of important things about this. One is you can change from month to month. You know, 1 month you could be a small quantity generator. You could do higher volumes the next month and then be a large quantity generator. So it's always important to understand in what category you fall, and then also understand what additional requirements you might have to do based on what category you actually are in that month. In addition to the generator requirements, because you treat with pesticides, if you treat with ACZA or CCA or any of the other heavy-duty industrial pesticides, bentonite or creosote, then your drip pad is also subject to subpart W, which is a different section of the hazardous waste standards, but no less important, of course. But if you treat with ACZA or CCA, then the waste that is removed from the drip pad is regulated under the waste code F035. That's the listed waste code that applies to any waste removed from a drip pad that treats with CCA or ACZA. In terms of disposal, most hazardous waste is either recycled and recovered. For example, a lot of fuel-based waste, if it has a high BTU value, also it's typically reused for fuel. A lot of waste is also incinerated. They even inject some straight into the ground under a program called underground injection. But the most common disposal method is landfill. And typically when waste is shipped from a treating facility to a disposal facility, landfill is the type of disposal method that's most commonly used. For waste that when it arrives at a disposal facility, typically what happens is the waste is placed into a roll-off box with other similar type wastes, and they add a little bit of Portland cement or some other type of cement or binding agent. This kind of solidifies the waste to reduce the leachability, and then that entire box is placed in a vault in the landfill. So if you've ever wondered what happens to your waste after it leaves your site, if it's going for a landfill, that's probably what happens. In the Southeast, chemical waste management in Amel, Alabama is typically where the waste is shipped. There are a couple of others in the United States where it could go. There's a facility in Kettleman, California, and a few others, but in the Southeast, it typically goes to Amel, Alabama for landfill. In terms of what you have to do to comply at your facility, first I want to talk about the accumulation standards. These are based on how you generate your waste and what you have to do with that waste on site. And there's two basic categories that you have to understand and know the differences between. The first is central accumulation, and then there's satellite accumulation. Under central accumulation, all drums have to have a hazardous waste label. The drums have to be closed at all times, except when removing or adding waste to it. The drum has to have an accumulation start date. That's the date that the waste was first placed in that drum. And then the drums have to be labeled to identify the hazards of the waste. You notice this is in green. This is a new requirement. So all drums at your site have to have an additional label now. EPA didn't specify what specific label you have to use. You could use GHS pictograms to meet this requirement. You could use a DOT placard to meet this requirement. And since waste is going to be shipped off site, it already has to have the DOT placard on it. So just make sure when you place the waste in the drum that you go ahead and have the DOT placard affixed to it. That seems to be the most easy, less rigorous requirement to meet that standard. So it is new, but make sure when you are generating your waste, when you inspect the drums and when you look at the drums, make sure that this label is always on the drum as well. And then drums do have storage time restrictions. Large quantity generators can store the waste for 90 days. Small quantity generators can store the waste up to 180 days. So always make sure you're meeting those storage time requirements as well. Under satellite, there is no time restriction for the drum, but the drum does have to be closed. You cannot exceed 55 gallons at any accumulation point. It has to be at or near the point of generation, so you can't have a random drum of waste somewhere at your site and call it satellite. It has to be at the point of generation. It does have to be labeled with the words hazardous waste. Also has to identify the hazards of the contents. Again, this is the same thing we were talking about before, so I would advise to just add the DOT placard for satellite drums as well. And then once full, that's when you would add the start date to the drum and move it to central accumulation within 3 days. So there's a few extra requirements for satellite. Specifically, you have to have it at the point of generation, and you can only generate up to 55 gallons. In terms of inspections, yes, you're required to do a few inspections. There are inspections you have to do for the drip pad, for the sumps, the pits underneath the cylinder door, the hazardous waste containers, cease drippage inspections, and also certifications of your drip pad. Looking a little closer at each one, first, the drip pad inspections. These have to be conducted every week and also after storms if your drip pad is not covered with a roof. You want to inspect for any deterioration of the drip pad, any malfunctions, any improper operation of the run-on and run-off systems. In other words, the berms. Make sure the berms are intact, they're operating properly. And you also want to check, if you have a leak detection system, you have to check weekly that it's leaking. And you also check for any cracks or deterioration of the drip pad surface. So when you find any deficiency, let's say you weren't aware there's a cracked berm, you're doing an inspection, you see a cracked berm, what does that mean? Well, you would note it on the inspection form, there's a cracked berm, and then you have to track the remediation of that. So let's say 2 days later, your maintenance department gets around to finally fixing that berm. You have to make sure that if you document a deficiency, that the remedy is also documented on the inspection form, the date it was performed and by who. So, you know, when you're reviewing your inspections, make sure if any deficiency is noted, that there's also an appropriate remediation. Otherwise, it looks like you identified an issue that wasn't fixed. And that goes for any inspection. In terms of the sumps and pits, these are referred to as subpart J units. For large quantity generators, you have to inspect them daily. weekly is required for small quantity generators, so they don't have to inspect them every day. But you inspect them to make sure that the pumps are operable. If they have a pump that pumps the liquid out, you have to inspect that pump to make sure it's working. And then you look for any signs of release. If there are any leaks, you want to note that and make sure that it's corrected if there are. And then secondary containment systems, you want to inspect those to detect any release as well. So those are subpart J inspections. It's a different form than the drip pad inspection, so make sure you have both. The next one is hazardous waste containers. Here you have to inspect the containers weekly, and you look at each container, inspecting it for proper labeling. You want to make sure it's got a hazardous waste label on it, that if it's a central accumulation container, you've got the correct start date on it. When you look at the start date, you obviously want to make sure that you're within the storage time, and if you're approaching that, make sure you've arranged for transportation off site in a timely manner. And you're also inspecting it for this other new label, the hazard label. In this case, hopefully the DOT placard seems to be the easiest. But you're also inspecting the container to make sure it's closed, and you're inspecting it to make sure the condition of the container is good, looking for any signs of corrosion, leaking, or any signs of damage to the container. In terms of cease drippage, here we're really talking about cease drippage from CCA treatment. In this case, you have to maintain records that the treated wood is held on the drip pad until it's ceased drippage. So that means that for any charge that comes out of the cylinder, someone has to inspect it and certify that it's no longer dripping before it's removed from the drip pad. So for every charge on the yard, that would mean there should be someone that certified that it wasn't dripping. You can keep this in a written form or electronic form. I believe our TreatRight system allows you to track this electronically. Just make sure you know how you're doing it and make sure you're maintaining the records. For the drip pad certification, this is required annually by a certified registered professional engineer. What they do is they come in and look at the drip pad and inspect it to make sure that it's operating and it's being maintained in accordance with the original design specifications. All of these inspections, I know they're different areas and so forth, but we do have templates that are available if you want one of these forms. I can help you get copies of them. Just shoot me an email or give me a call. There are some other plans and programs you have to have on site associated with hazardous waste. The first is a hazardous waste contingency plan. Now, it's not a new requirement to have a contingency plan, but there are several new requirements associated with the plan that you have to follow. First, you have to have a quick reference guide. This specifically, you have to list the type and amounts of hazardous waste, identify any hazardous waste where exposure would require special treatment by a medical or hospital staff, a map of the facility showing where it's generated and stored, also a street map of the facility, locations of water supply, including fire hydrants, any notification systems, alarm systems that you have, and who your emergency coordinators are and their 24-hour numbers. So what this is a very elaborate summary that has to be placed in the front of your contingency plan. So your plan hasn't changed, but you have to have this new reference guide in the front of it. EPA did specify that you don't have to amend your plan to immediately do all these things, but the first time you're required to update your plan for any other reason, then you have to address these requirements as well. And keep in mind that when you update your contingency plan, that copies have to be submitted to your emergency agencies, the fire department, the police department, and the hospital in your area. You also have to have a storage yard drippage plan. This is a plan that details how drips are managed on the yard and that they are cleaned up properly. You also have to have a plant operating history. The operating history would detail when the plant was constructed, designed, historically what treatments have been performed, what chemicals you've used. has to be updated through the life of the facility. So if you add a new treating chemical, then you should update this plant operating history. And also you're required to do training. For anyone that has a role with hazardous waste, whether it's someone at your site that does inspections or provides remediation for those inspections, or any other role associated with hazardous waste, whether it's labeling, make sure those people are included in annual hazardous waste training. The training that we're doing today can satisfy that if you keep the records for it, but make sure the people that don't attend this also get the training they need annually on site. There's also some reporting requirements that you have to meet. There are binary reports for large quantity generators. This is a summary of all the waste you've generated and where it was shipped during that year. It's required every other year by EPA, but some states do require this annually, but it's only for large quantity generators. You also have to submit manifest exceptions. So when you ship your waste off site, you ship it with a copy of the manifest that summarizes how much is shipped and where it's going and so forth. When that waste is received by the TSD, then they sign it as received and send you a copy of that manifest back. So this kind of completes the chain of custody of the waste shipment. You are required to notify EPA if you don't receive a copy of that manifest. You have to notify them 45 days for a large quantity generator and 60 for a small. So really what you want to do is you want to try to avoid having to do this. So you have to track your manifest shipments and make sure you have copies back. So for example, for a large quantity generator, you have to report to EPA in 45 days. So I would say within 35 or 40 days, you reach out to the TSD and have them send the manifest copy back. That way you don't have to submit the report to EPA. But the important thing there is to make sure you keep and have copies of the signed manifest that, kind of completes the chain of custody for the shipping record. You also might have to report spills if you have any on site. At what level you have to report a spill depends on what chemical you're talking about. For example, CCA concentrate has a very low threshold for reporting. It's about 1 gallon. If you spilled 1 gallon of CCA out of containment, that would have to be reported. Copper azole has a much higher level, but it's important to understand which chemical is spilled, what the levels are. The SDS actually lists these. You can look up the requirements there, or you can give me a call. We can go through them together. Also, the posters that we provide for each of the chemicals provide those thresholds as well. One important note that's new here for reporting: small quantity generators have to re-notify the agency every 4 years. This was the first year that's required. It was September 1st of this year. Most states sent out a reminder. I know Georgia sent out a reminder saying, remember to do this. But if you have any questions about what was required there, or if you need to do it, just give me a call. A couple of new items to note specifically regarding the generator improvements rule. One is episodic generation. This is actually a good thing that EPA did. It allows a very small quantity generator or a small quantity generator to maintain their generator status without having to change if they have, for example, like one spill, or if they have one planned event of a tank cleanout. You do have to notify the agency 30 days prior to doing this to comply with the requirements. If you had a spill, you have to notify 72 hours after the unplanned event. Otherwise, you have to go up to the other categories. But this allows you to stay in the same category without updating all of your stuff. Obviously, the next month you would go back to the same category. But there were several changes with this rule. There's over 60 changes to the regulations. Here's a link to all of the different changes in the in the form of a fact sheet. I would advise everyone to review that, make sure they understand all the different requirements. But EPA did publish the rule, but it depends on what state you're in to know whether or not you have to comply with these requirements now. Here's a table of all the different states and where it's implemented The only states where it's not implemented are the ones here in yellow. Those states have not adopted the new rule, so they're not in effect. Where the states are blue and green, they are in effect. So, and if this, I actually pulled this from EPA's website on the generator improvements rule, but I would advise looking at this website and following what your state is doing to know when the rule actually goes into effect in your state. So, any questions?
No questions so far, Michael. Thank you.
All right, yeah, absolutely. Everyone, always feel free to contact me with questions later or shoot me an email, give me a call. I appreciate it.
Michael,
Yes.
let's send that link to everyone in the follow-up that we send after the presentations.
Okay,
Okay.
sure.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I believe we have a question. Number 6. Large quantity generators, LQG, are defined as generating 6 million pounds of hazardous waster per month. True or false?
Hey, Grady, no fair making fun that I can't type.
You caught that.
Yeah, I did. Can y'all believe he's so mean to me? I tell you.
We are at 77%, coming up on 1 minute. Just a reminder, if you need these CEU credits, you need to really be responding to these polls.
Okay, I think that's all we're going to get, Sarah. Okay, the answer is false. Okay, let's move on to our next presenter, and that is Josh Roth. He's going to talk to us about pressure treatment and building codes. Josh has a manager of codes and standards since he joined LSI Wood Protection in 2019. He is no stranger to the wood treatment and construction industry, having spent 20 plus years as a state licensed general contractor, a private developer, and a building official and a planning director. As a general contractor, he managed $25+ million of work annually that included multifamily, commercial, utilities, single family, and many new and redevelopments. Before joining LSI, Josh spent 9 years as an ICC certified building official for several jurisdictions in Georgia. He has taught continuing education in the code industry for 15 years. Josh has extensive technical experience, serving as, among others, the 2022 Group B Admin ICC Code Development Committee, as a voting member of ASTM E05 and ASTM D07 committees, and as a member of the 2018 IRC Code Task Force. He holds a state contractor license and has his ICC CBO license. And Josh belongs to many professional organizations, including ICC, ASTM, AWPA, WWPI, TWC, and is past president of BOAG. Josh, you're up.
Thanks, Grady. That was a mouthful. Sorry. I'll tone that down next time for you, okay? Well, it's good to hopefully talk to everyone this afternoon. What we were going to talk about a little bit is evaluation reports and how they're related to what you guys do there at your plant. and mainly want to give you some broader strokes of information so you understand what the relationship is between what you're doing and how it's actually used in the field, and what requirements are there for it to be used in the field. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about is when you look at evaluation reports, a lot of people probably don't even know what those are. So basically, to start with, we'll explain what ES reports or evaluation reports are. There's 3 main companies that provide those evaluation reports. One is ICC, widely known because of the building codes. One is Intertech. A lot of you may know Intertech also. And then also we have one more, which is UL. A lot of people know UL and are familiar with it because it's a very popular name. So they all provide these evaluation reports. And these reports are to assist the building department and the architects as they are reviewing or designing a project. What that does is it makes sure that the product that they're using is actually going to be compliant with the building code. And that's a very important thing. We know the building code may specify a specific thing to be used. It may say you must use a fire retardant treated wood in a specific area. But what does that actually mean? How do you prove that your product meets that standard of being a piece of fire retardant treated wood? Well, that's where the evaluation reports come into play. And again, there's several different ones that you can use. They all are basically do the same thing. And what that is to evaluate your product to make sure that it meets those building codes. We use a lot of reports for us are through ICC. We do have some through UL also for the Canadian market because that's a more recognized name there in Canada. So what's in these evaluation reports? Well, let me see if I can move my screen. And it doesn't want to let me do that. So awesome. So what's in an evaluation report? Here's a few things to start with. First is it gives you a division. And all that is basically where to find that product. So when you're designing a new building or structure, one of the things that they use is a program called CSI. And CSI has basically come up with a way to enumerate all different types of products and what they are. So if you look there on the screen, you see division, you see 06. Well, 06 is specific to wood products. Okay, so it's wood, plastics, and any kind of components. They're all basically under that one area of 06. But then you look at the next one, it says section, and that basically breaks it down even further to what that specific product is. So in this case, it's fire retardant treated wood on this evaluation report that I'm using today. Then, and again, that basically does not have much bearing on what you all are doing. It just is a standardized way of identifying what the product is and what its use is. Then you move on a little bit further on a typical report. you're going to have the report holder's name. That's who that report belongs to. So that would be in our case, maybe you see some, it says Archwood. That's probably because of some of the earlier folks that we were discussing about EPA and making adjustments and how difficult it is to make some adjustments. So currently, most of our existing reports are in Arch due to that. Then you look a little further and it's going to have the subject, which is what it is. In this case, the subject is dry con, fire retardant treated wood. And if you go a little further, if you would, Belinda, please click over to the next one, because I don't think it's wanting to let me do that today. There we go. All right. So as you go a little bit further, it's going to give you more information. It's going to give you a scope. And basically the scope is really where you have to look at. This is what the building officials, the inspectors, your architects, this is what they're looking for right here. One of the main things. And underneath that scope, it's going to tell you which codes this product has been evaluated under. So with this specific one, our dry con, the ESR 1626, it's compliant with 2018, 2015, 2012, 2009, 2006, all of those building codes, the IBC. Those are different revisions that have happened, and it's compliant. The scope, it meets that scope in all of those building codes. And that can be a little important for you because, believe it or not, just because there's a new building code, we have a brand new one that just came out, the 2021 series of codes. Believe it or not, there's probably not very many jurisdictions that are on those specific codes right now. You may have half a dozen that have adopted that code. Most jurisdictions are at least a code cycle behind, or two. So most of the US is on the 2018 IBC in the 2018 series of codes. So that's where it kind of gets important. Now, that could change next year in 2021 when people start adopting it. We will have to have our product evaluated to that code. And if there's changes that happen in that code that are specific to the product, like maybe they change a requirement or they add a different type of test, then our product would have to provide evidence that it can pass that test to be able to say that it is evaluated under the newest building code or the 2021. Right now, that did not happen for 2021. So this will be a easier way. We just have to pay them to editorially make an adjustment to the report. So probably in the next 6 months, it'll say 2021 on the report. So that is important with that scope. Also, with that scope, it also talks about what's evaluated in the report. What did they look at? How did they prove that this is a piece of fire retardant treated wood? Well, one of the areas that's listed in this report is flame spread. One is structural. Another is corrosion, hygroscopicity, and then fire resistant rated wall assemblies. So all of those areas are broken down in this document, and it shows how this product proved that it met all of the requirements for a piece of fire retardant treated wood. So when you go down a little bit further, it talks about uses.
Josh, we can't hear you anymore. And I can't read lips that well.
Where the code permits the use of wood or fire retardant treated wood. So it may be able to do that on a short term during construction type of situation. The next area it goes into is it gives you a description of what can be used. So in this description, it also tells us what different products or species of wood that we can use. Give me 1 second. I'm going to see if I can do something to assist my internet. See if it's on my end. Give me 1 second. All right, maybe that'll make it a little bit better. Close pulse. Yes, ma'am, I will try to do that real quick. All right, I did that too. So maybe that'll help also. Thank you, Belinda. So some other areas that you move into is flame spread. What is the requirement for the flame spread for it? Well, it's 25 or less whenever they test to E84. And that E84 is a 30-minute test, not a 10-minute test. But the flame spread is actually based on the first 10 minutes of that test. So then it goes a little further. It tells you what they test for structural and strength. And it also separates out lumber and plywood because there's different tests for different species and different lumber or plywood depending on what you're doing. And they go into corrosion. Is it corrosive or not? How does it react with other metals? All of that testing has to be completed also. Now, after you do that, section 4 is very, very important also because it relates to the design and installation of the product. Now, what happens if a customer buys a piece of, say, fire retardant treated wood and they go and they put it in, but they don't follow the directions that are on the evaluation report of how to install it? Well, what happens if you install something incorrectly? Does the warranty still apply? Usually not, right? Same thing happens with just about any product you buy. If you don't follow the manufacturer's instructions, then you're probably not going to be covered under the warranty. So that's something that you have to look at, and if we're ever dealing with our end users, that we want to make sure that they understand that also, that there are specifications of how to use the product. One of those is strength design. So once that wood has been pressure treated and has the fire retardant in it, it's changed it structurally somewhat. So in this report, it actually gives you boxes to look at to see what differences there are and what is the design standard, what they have to use whenever they're designing this. So I'll give you an example. If you take a basic piece of southern yellow pine and its strength, compression strength is 1, because it's just a standard piece of pine. After it has been treated, that compression strength has to be calculated at 0.94 instead of 1. So there's a small reduction in its compressive strength. Again, horizontal, tension, elasticity, and then the extreme fiber stress is also, those numbers are in this ES report. So that the person who's using the product or is speccing the product has all of the information that they need right there in that report to be able to use that product correctly and design it as how it's supposed to be used in the specific application that they're using it in. Section 5, it's another important section, talks about the conditions of use. And basically that just says, hey, you have to use this document and read it, and you have to use all of the strength design factors that are in here for the lumber and the plywood and the different species. You have to run these calculations so that you're designing it correctly. And what does that mean in the layman's terms or in a real world application? Well, if you think about trusses on a roof, I'm sure most everybody has seen a new building being put up, and you can visualize a truss that's on the roof. Well, you know, the plywood runs in the opposite direction. So you've got your trusses running vertical and you have your plywood running horizontal. Well, how far apart are the trusses normally? Well, normally trusses are designed to be on 2-foot centers. But the designer has to run these numbers, these calculations, to make sure that if he buys a piece of 1/2 inch or 15-30 seconds piece of plywood, is it going to still span at 24 inches on center? Well, it might not. It might not meet that anymore. Maybe they have to put the trusses on 19.2 centers. That's another popular number to use for centering of trusses. Or maybe they have to go to 16 inch on center. Or maybe they have to buy a piece of 3/4 inch plywood instead, a thicker piece that can spread that weight and hold it structurally, since you have to run those design numbers to see what the differences are. So it's just to give you a real world application so you can visualize what that would mean. Now on a 2x4, same thing. As a designer's designing, he can add the weight up and see what that stud is supposed to be holding. And again, he can use the numbers that are in this ES report or in any evaluation report to see what, how he should design it. Maybe he has to use a 2x6, or again, maybe he has to put them closer together, or he can put them further apart to be able to carry that load. Now, one that's a little bit more, well, let me backtrack. I missed number 6 there. The evidence that is submitted. So how are we able to get this report? Well, basically, we as the distributor of the chemicals have to have all of this testing done and audited and sent in a data package to be approved. And that is no small feat in itself. That's what you hear R&D. What's R&D working on? Well, a lot of time that's what most of R&D is working on. They're spending a lot of time on coming up, testing, having to send products to a third party, to a lab to have these independent tests run, so that then we can take that evidence, put it in a big package, and send it off to whoever's going to issue the evaluation report. So that's a big job. It takes a lot of time and effort lot of upfront work that a lot of people don't realize. They're just like, oh yeah, well just ship us some more of that, you know, dry con, here it comes. But maybe they don't understand what is behind getting that product to you before it even comes to market. It's a lot of work. So number 7, this one's more important to you all. Number 7 is the identification. And I'm sure all of you know, most of your plants, you have to identify what you're shipping out, whether it be a piece of dry con or it be a piece of pressure treated wood. You have to put a tag on the end of the pressure treated wood, or you put a stamp on dry con. And there's requirements that are in the building code that tell us what has to be on that stamp. And basically that's reiterated in this document. Also in this document, we have to provide them with an example of what the stamp would look like. So that way, if the inspector's looking at it, when he's in the field, he can take this document and he can flip to the right page and he say, okay, yeah, this is so-and-so's fire retardant treated plywood or pressure treated wood because it has this stamp on it or this tag on it. That way they can identify it and tell if it's a fake product or if it's a real product. So the stamps are very important, and it's very important. I tell you, all of the dry con stamps I've seen have been really good. So you guys are doing a really good job with those stamps. But I've seen some from some other vendors that were kind of hard to read sometimes, and that can cause problems in the field. If they're hard to read, then guess what? The inspector can't tell and it doesn't match what's in the report. He's liable to say, okay, well, I need some documentation that proves to me that this is what you say it is. And then that's when you get the call from the architect or from the contractor upset because he didn't pass his inspection because the guy couldn't read the stamp. So I'm sure that's happened to some of you in the past. So it's a very interesting document, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time on it because a lot of people don't know what an evaluation report is. So hopefully you understand what an evaluation report is now. And again, it can come from 3 different places. UL is a very popular one, Intertech is popular, and so is ICC. Currently, if you deal with dry con or you deal with womanized, those products have ICC evaluation reports is what they have. And I'm sure you guys have them tucked away somewhere so that you can take a look at them or send them off to an architect or engineer to be able to use. So that's kind of that side of things. And then I wanted to spend just a few minutes discussing generic building code requirements. And I know I mentioned a little earlier about building codes and how that they are different all over the US. So I want to give you kind of the hierarchy of how that works. So maybe you have a little bit of an understanding of how it could affect where you ship your products, and if you ever have issues in the future, you may have an understanding of how it works. So as I mentioned before, ICC is the main pusher of new codes. They are the one that provides the new codes. They provide a process for new building codes. And they're every 3 years, they produce new books and new building codes. And basically, for that to happen, it takes 3 years for that to happen because that process is a really long process. This last, or a couple weeks ago, we were having committee meetings in Pittsburgh, and there were 1,200 different items that had to go to a vote, each one with discussion, for, against, and then a vote of whether it was going to be in the next building code. Well, there's so many different items that they have to split it up into what they call an A cycle and a B cycle. So the A cycle takes a year, the B cycle takes a year, and then it takes them a year to be able to put it all together in a book and get it pushed out to the public. So that's why a lot of times different jurisdictions, different states, it's fractured, and they're dealing with different codes, different years, and that can make things difficult sometimes whenever you have a question, maybe a technical question from a contractor that's having an issue in the field. That's the first question that I always ask. Okay, well, tell me, where's the jurisdiction and what is the building code? What are they on? What are they using? Because believe it or not, a lot of people are still using a 2006 code. It may seem old, but what a lot of people do is they amend that code individually as a jurisdiction or as in a state. So I give you an example of how that works. In the state of Georgia, I'm very familiar with it here, so that's where I'm from. They take that 2018 code and they go through it, each book, and they make amendments to that code specifically for what they feel needs to be done in the state of Georgia. Now, once it's done in Georgia, everybody is required to meet that same code as the bare minimum code in Georgia. Now, you take Texas, for example. That seems to be kind of simple. Georgia says, okay, it's going to be the 2018 building code. You can look in those code books, and that's our code, but you better go get a list of all of the exemptions that they've made to that code or provisions that they've added to that code. And believe it or not, there's a lot of them. The building code in Georgia has probably 5 pages worth of amendments. The plumbing code has 20 pages worth of amendments. The residential code has about 5. So there's a wide variety in the states, and then there's a wide variety that could be also in a local jurisdiction. So Texas, for example, they adopt a state building code, but that state building code is only enforced on state-owned properties and the college system of Texas. So what does that mean for Dallas and Houston and all these other cities? Austin? Well, every city has the option to adopt what they want to adopt. So that can make things a little difficult. If you can imagine, you've got all of these cities, 100 different cities could technically adopt 100 different versions of the same code. So that definitely can make a difference in that technical side when somebody's asking a question. Now, you also have states like California and Florida. New York is another one. Those 3 states actually produce their own building code. Basically, they take the ICC, a copy of it, and they go through the whole book and they make all the amendments that they want to make, and then they actually produce a new book with their name on the front of it. The good news is that everybody has to abide by that same code because it's a state adopted building code. But usually they're on an odd year cycle. So when ICC came out with a 2018, the Florida building code came out with a 2017. And basically they took the 2018 and the 2015 and they smashed it together, made their own amendments, and then settled on, okay, this is what our code is going to be. So that's what can make things very difficult when it comes to speccing specific things out, and ensuring that they're built to the correct code in that area. That can definitely make things difficult for the contractor, for the designer, but ultimately it can make things more difficult for the treater or for the manufacturer in the way of having to explain how their product is working and what their product is related to. So that's why it's good. If you remember before, I said that the scope, that's why it's good to use a product that has many different years worth of scope in it, because basically that means that just about no matter what code that jurisdiction has approved, that product is going to be able to be used under those code sections. And believe it or not, there are times that the code does change, and you may have a product that was good in a 2015, under a 2015 building code and a 2012 building code, that may no longer be any good for 2018 or 2021. And so you have to also watch out for those items. And again, that's on the designer side and the building official, building inspector side mostly. Good news is all of our products are used all throughout. So you can have that 2018, 2021, 2015, it doesn't matter. But I wanted to make sure that everybody kind of had a general understanding of how that works and why it can be difficult to keep up with, because there's a lot of different codes and a lot of different jurisdictions. So let's see if I can skip another page, please. All right, now I'm going to go back a little bit to the evaluation report, shake it up a little bit for you. So an evaluation report we talked about is a document that says that the product's good, right? It says it meets compliance to the building code. But if you remember, I was talking about what is in that. There's test requirements for what you have to provide documentation of for that product to meet that code. And maybe you remember or not, I was talking about you've got hygroscopicity, you've got flame spread, durability, corrosion, all of those different things that are tested in that document. But there's another document that is very important. That document tells you what you have to test for a specific product. And what that's called is an acceptance criteria. So the acceptance criteria it basically tells you, okay, if you're going to say that your product meets this, here's the testing that is required. Here's what you have to prove. So the acceptance criteria is important because it provides that direction of what testing has to be complied with. So when you're making a new product, you have to look at these acceptance criteria so that you're able to understand what testing you're going to be required to do. Then once you take that acceptance criteria, you can do the testing, then you apply for the evaluation report, and then you can get your evaluation report approved because you've given them the data that was required for that specific product. So the acceptance criteria is one popular one is AC66. That's for the fire retardants. There's another one, 326, that deals more of pressure treated products for ACC, all kinds of different stuff. Yeah, there's all kinds. Those are your two main ones. AC 66, we do have to watch it because they do open these and they do evaluate them, and they do often make adjustments to them. So we're required to make sure that we stay on top of what those changes may be. That way we can keep you all up to date and make sure that our products meet those new requirements. Again, we said that the building code may change, and if that building code changes, then the acceptance criteria may have to change also. So we have to keep a close eye on that to make sure that we're up to date on what those are. Go ahead and click. I think I have one more slide, or is that the last one? Okay, I did want to spend a couple minutes on giving a explanation of, or drawing some differences of, and some other products that are out there. There is a product that's being evaluated right now where we have a proposed acceptance criteria of AC 516. And AC 516 is basically for a dip or a spray-on fire retardant. And they have had a difficult time getting this passed, getting that acceptance criteria approved. They did get it approved, but currently there are no products out there that are able to pass the testing that's required for them. And it makes sense. You all understand, coming from the pressure treated side, if you take a piece of pressure treated wood and you cut it open in half, you can tell that there's chemicals have been pushed inside of it. Whereas if you would take a penetrant, and a lot of people, I mean, when you use that word penetrant, a lot of people don't even know what a penetrant might be. Probably the easiest one that everybody recognizes would be like a stain, Minwax, something like that. That's a penetrant. So if you dip it in a penetrant and then you cut it, what do you see? Well, you're only going to see the penetrant on the very outside, right? So there is a difference, and it does make a difference in the testing that's required, especially for the fire retardants, to be able to provide that protection. Now, yeah, different lumbers, different species. Does the chemical push all the way into the middle? No, it doesn't. But you can definitely, it's not just right there on the very outside like it was just coated on. It is pushed into the lumber or plywood. So there's you may see or may hear some more information about that in the future, about penetrants, and we have to keep a close eye on that to make sure that it's meeting the same standards that are required for fire retardant treated wood, especially since fire retardant treated wood is listed in the building code as something that is a permissive type of product to meet the building code. All right, you can click one more for me. I think that will be the last one if you click. Yep, code officials. So here's what's interesting about that. That process is that for an acceptance criteria, there's a 10-member board that are building officials. And basically those 10 members vote on acceptance criteria for new products. And they're the only ones that can vote. So it's not a very big audience. You've got 10 people. You do have people that get involved and testify because it is an open process. I would suggest if you guys would sign up so that you can know what's coming up on the public hearing side, because it means something to treaters. There can be a push to have a new product that comes on that may be inferior, and if they can convince that 10-member board to approve an acceptance criteria for them that they can pass, then it could be detrimental to the industry, and mainly could give a black eye because maybe the product doesn't work as good. And we definitely don't want that. We don't. So how can you get involved? If you look on, if you do a Google search of ICCES.org, maybe put public hearings in there, do a search, you'll be able to find, and there's a link that you can click on to ask to be put on the list of informed parties. If you're not, there's no, they only inform the ones that are on their list. So it's not quite as public as the building codes. So if you guys have any questions going forward, building code questions, questions with ASTM, we spend a lot of time dealing with those, working on what the next standards are going to be. Please feel free to reach out and let us know and ask. That's what we're here for. I love answering questions. I'd much rather do this class in person so I can get a feel for everybody. It's a lot harder to do it whenever it's online like this. So, but if you've got any questions, please let us know and we'll be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. That's the end of our presentations. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this year's virtual LSI Plant Operator Seminar. Please expect a certificate to be emailed to you shortly after the seminar. As a reminder, some of you will be required to take a final exam. Please complete and submit this as quickly as possible. On behalf of LSI Wood Protection and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Grady. Thank you to the presenters, and thank you to everyone who attended and listened so carefully.
Okay, thank you.